Hello. In 2008, Warhammer 40,000 finally hit the role-playing tabletop after many years of near misses, and it quickly became one of the most popular games available. It would soon be followed by 4 more 40k role-playing games that would explore the 41st millennium in a way that had never been attempted before. My guest today helped to develop and creatively lead games like Dark Heresy, Rogue Trader, and Deathwatch. And having worked at Fantasy Flight Games during their incredible creation and expansion of 40k role-playing, we get to talk about how working with Games Workshop actually worked, how to handle the IP, and what became of the ill-fated MMO Warhammer 40,000 Dark Millennium. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with role-playing game designer Ross Watson. Ross, thank you for joining me. I like to start by just getting into your personal history. How did you get into gaming in the first place? Sort of what was your first steps into the gaming hobby?
Well, thank you for having me, Jordan. It's a real pleasure to be here. I got into the gaming hobby as a young man. I was maybe 8 years old, and my father bought me the red box of D&D, with the Larry Elmore cover, Dungeons and
Right.
Dragons. And I started playing right away. So 1983, I'm playing role-playing games, and it just stayed with me for the rest of my life. But it really accelerated junior high and high school. We just started playing like every day during the lunch hour, during the lunch break. We would just get together and play, and we played everything. You know, we played Dungeons and Dragons, we played Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, we played Rifts, we played Marvel superheroes and Star Wars, and we just played like all these different games every day of the week. So it sunk in, you know.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's an incredible time back then to be able to sort of invest that in that like gaming education, I suppose.
It was wild. And
Yeah.
it really sharpened my improv skills too.
I'll bet, yeah. I mean, if you're at the table every day for a game, I mean, then how did that sort of turn into a professional thing? How did you make the leap into it as a career?
I really I look back on my career sometimes and I just marvel at how fortunate I have been, because it is literally just luck in a lot of cases. I was living in Louisville, Kentucky. In You guys might call it Louisville, the way it's spelled. Um, Louisville, Kentucky, and I had just gotten out of the army, and I hooked up with a local gaming group. And one of my friends in the gaming group was like, "Hey, you know D&D pretty well, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I've been playing it, for a really long time." And he says, "There's this company that I know that's looking for a line editor." And I said, "Well, sure, that sounds great." So here we are, the year's 2000, and I'm contacting somebody and saying, "Hey, I want to be a D&D line editor for you." It's a little game company called Citizen Games. They didn't make very many products, but it got my foot in the door. And once you get your foot in the door, like everything else kind of opens up wide. And I started getting more and more jobs and more opportunities. Um, and I freelanced for a really long time,
Hmm.
up until 2003. I was a freelancer. I would just submit stuff, and sometimes on spec, or sometimes more often I would get an assignment and then I'd write it and
Hmm.
turn it in. And then in 2003, I got my first full-time gig. Uh, Games Workshop actually was
Right.
looking for a copy editor, or a copywriter. And I thought, what the heck? I want to get out of Louisville. I'd like to go do something else. So I threw my hat in the ring. I just, said, sure, I know how to write, and I also love Games Workshop. And I got this message back saying, yes, we would like to interview you. And okay. This was a big deal. Again, I'd only been working, for like 3 years, and I'd just been turning in, little magazine articles or little stuff with little companies. But Games Workshop was the real deal. That was a big step. And I moved to Maryland, to Glen Burnie, which is the headquarters for the U.S. side at the time. And yeah, they hired me on, and I got to work on the U.S. White Dwarf team, and it was amazing.
Right. Amazing. Yeah. So what were you doing on White Dwarf then? You said it was a copy editor. Is that like contributing articles and content, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it was. So they had an editor, a separate one for the website
Right.
at the time, and they primarily put me on like promotional materials, and then I worked my way up to where I was actually sitting and recording battle reports in the studio, and I was writing tactics articles for the Bretonians for sixth edition and things like that.
Right.
And it really grew me as a writer, because it's one thing to be able to write fairly well, but it's another thing to learn how to edit.
Hmm.
And once you learn how to edit, it actually really, in my case anyway, it really improved my ability to write. So I was steadily getting better at producing content. And I wrote a bunch of stuff for Black Gobbo, and I wrote some stuff for White Dwarf. And then we had there was some really interesting stuff going on in the studio at the time. They were making these giant catalogs. I have some down in the bottom corner there, which I can show you if you really want to see. But there's these giant catalogs, and inside they had little tactics sections next to the models. I wrote all that stuff, and I wrote it just was great. I got to work with some guys that are well-known guys, like Dave Taylor was my boss for quite a while. And the best painting I ever did in my life is I showed it to Dave, and he was like, it's not bad. Getting a not bad from Dave Taylor, I was like, I'm a good painter, guys. But for real, I got to work with Dave Taylor. I got to work with a bunch of guys that would go on to found Gale Force 9.
Right.
I got to work with Nick Davis and Drew Will, who went on to work for Mantic. It was a really interesting time, and I got to meet a lot of really good people, Jeremy Vitok and the guy John Stallard, who founded Warlord.
Sure, so. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and those catalogs in particular, they are really well remembered now. There's like collector's pieces. Everyone loves those. There's the US catalogs, so it's a big win. But I mean, how did the White Dwarf? How did the US version work? I know there were a couple of like international versions, but there was a UK version being produced, obviously, and then that was sent over. And like, what was the sort of brief in terms of let's create localized content, or what was the thinking there?
So, got to remember, at this time I was pretty low man on the totem pole, so I wasn't privy to a lot of the big conversations. But I did know that each big studio, each regional studio at the time, was kind of making their own version of White Dwarf, different covers, different content. I mean, there was like a core set of content that was sent from the UK, but then each of the regionals got to make their own little sections. I know we did a lot of modeling stuff of like, here's a showcase of how all of our guys made these particular models. I think the Wood Elves had just come out for 6th edition, so there was a lot of like, Wood Elf conversion things and trees and terrain. Sometimes that situation would mean that we would plan out like, okay, here's what we would like to do, and sometimes we get pushed back on that, and sometimes it would be like, yeah, sure, you can put that in. It was a bit of a Wild West time, and I was actually let go from the studio when they decided to centralize everything, and they got rid of the regional Games Workshop studios and made the White Dwarf just come out from the UK. That was the only team doing it after that. That happened in 2005. So late 2004, early 2005.
Sure, right. So then you obviously moved on from working at GW, and then you found yourself at FFG. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about like how you ended up with Fantasy Flight. Yeah,
for sure. So it's another just really lucky event, but so I left Games Workshop 2005, and I was still doing freelancing, and I was still actually writing for White Dwarf as a freelancer for a little while. And about 2008, the first edition of Dark Heresy came out. It was a big deal. Everybody was like, ooh, but it had that sort of it had that moment where Black Industries was like, we can't make this anymore. It came out, lasted for like I want to say a week, 2 weeks. It was a very short period of time.
It was,
and then they were like,
and
they're like, we're done.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, to me that was astonishing. I'd never seen anything like that happen before in the role-playing game industry. And I'd been freelancing for Fantasy Flight on a bunch of different products, so they knew me over there. So I contacted them and said, "Hey, I hear you've got some stuff brewing with at the time Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition, and I'd like to work on that because it had just come out too." And I got an email back saying, "Well, we're not going to do D&D 4th edition, but what we are going to do is we're going to do 40K roleplay, and we see that you've worked at Games Workshop. Would you like to come interview for that?" And I was like, yes. So I flew out. I think June is when I first started working there, 2008. So just a few months had passed since the release of the initial set of Dark Heresy stuff from Black Industries, and Fantasy Flight had picked it up. So I got there, and they're like, "Great, Fantasy Flight has this habit where, or at least they did at that time, of throwing people into the deep end." I showed up. I was like, "Hi, I'm Ross." And they're like, "Great, here's this unpublished manuscript, and here's this book that needs to be edited, and here's this, and just like, and we also need a budget, and we need you to work on production, and we need you to like a bunch of stuff I'd never done before." I showed up at Fantasy Flight, and I kind of call it like a crucible, but I showed up there as a writer who could also edit. And within a few months, I was a writer, an editor, a developer, a layout guy, a production guy, a budget guy, art director. Like I had learned so many skills. It was insane. But the thing about Fantasy Flight was it was such a small team. At the time, it was like one guy, and then I showed up, and I was now a team of 2, and then Jay Little showed up, and it was a team of 3. And for probably the first 6 months or a year, it was just like 3 guys, and we were like, okay, we got to do all of the things. And we started finding people, and I grabbed one of our editors, Sam Stewart. I was like, "Sam, 40K, come here. I basically abducted him into our team. And Sam, of course, went on to become the line editor for Black Crusade, and he's now working on Genesis and stuff. So like he's gone on a journey too. But yeah, it was really, really cool. We got of course Black Industries, Kate Flack, Mike Mason, Owen Barnes. Those are the big names that made the initial Dark Heresy, and it was amazing. So we kind of built on that. And the very first book I worked on was a bestiary called Creatures Anathema. It went on to win an award, so yay. But it was a heck of a learning curve because, at first I was like, "Oh, I'm going to put one of those thought for the days on every page." And then I realized it's a 244-page book. There's not that many thoughts for the day. There's a lot, but there's not that many. And, so it's a learning curve. I commissioned way too many words for my books, and I had to like cut pieces out and then move those pieces into other books until I learned what the correct word count was for our layout size, things of that nature. It was a really interesting thing. Now, what's crazy about Fantasy Flight, of course, is it was primarily a board game company. They were making a lot of big board games like Twilight Imperium and Arkham Horror, stuff like that. And the CEO was known to be very hands-on. He was known to be he was known to be a guy who would walk into the room and say, "Okay, I need to see everything." Right? And surprisingly, he didn't want to do that for 400-page books about Warhammer 40,000. So we were like the one little part of Fantasy Flight that was basically left alone. We were like, "Okay, we're gonna show off our final product," and he would look at the front cover, he'd look at the back cover, he'd like flip through it and be like, "Okay, this looks good." Whereas all the other parts of the company that were making miniature games or making board games were just like sweating, when they had to bring something in. So it was a really interesting dynamic within the company. But our first year, we made, I think, 4 or 5 different books for Dark Heresy, and they all did really well. And then we made Rogue Trader, which was, I think, the biggest selling product we made for 2009. And then we made Deathwatch, which was our biggest selling product for 2010. So we were 40K Roleplay was doing really, really well at the time. It was a real pleasure to work there, and it was a real pleasure to work on it. I got to work with so many great writers, so many great designers, so many great artists, layout guys, graphic design. The guy who created the logo for Rogue Trader, for example, Kevin Childress, he's amazing. He's now a creative director over at one of the big video game companies.
Right.
But
Great.
yeah, super talented people, just tons of talented folks.
Yeah.
Some of those guys would go on to bigger careers. Nathan Dowdell is a guy that I found doing Tyranid Dark Heresy profiles on a website, like a blog. He would say, okay, here's what I think the Tyranid should look like in Dark Heresy. And I looked at it, I was like, man, he's actually really good. So I reached out and hired him. I was like, I want you to write for me. And now he's over at Modifius, and he made Star Trek Adventures, and he made a whole bunch of really good stuff. It feels like the time at Fantasy Flight was like ripples in a pond, and it's still spreading and coming back around.
Well, yeah, and it was because it was a lot of content created during that time by Fantasy Flight. I mean, you mentioned the sort of different strands of 40k roleplay. Obviously, it wasn't just okay. Here in this game, you're playing everything. You're playing Marines or Imperial Guards or Rogue Traders or Traitor Marines or whatever it might be. They were split out into those different game systems essentially.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what was the sort of thinking at FFG around that? Like, we're not going to do just like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay where you can play anything from within the world of Wolfrup is all available to you. We're going to take it and we're going to break it apart into these different types of game, I suppose. Like, what was the sort of the brief that led to that?
Well, originally Black Industries had a plan that they had spoken about openly of doing Dark Heresy and then Rogue Trader and then Deathwatch.
Right.
And I was like, that's a great plan. Like, I went in thinking like that was a good foundation to build on. And seeing the sales for Dark Heresy, there was definitely pressure from my boss. He was like, I would like another core book, please. I would like another game line. And I was like, okay, great, because as much as I love Dark Heresy, it's a very particular feel. It's not unlike, for example, say Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in some cases, because you are a nobody who becomes maybe a somebody if you're lucky, right? So I was like, well, we could do is Rogue Traders and Deathwatch characters. Those are definitely somebodies. They are not nobodies. There's no such thing as a nobody who's a Rogue Trader. You could be a gang scum in Dark Heresy, and that was fine, and that's cool because that's what that game's about. But Rogue Trader gave us a different place to start from, an idea of like, okay, you are big deals. You are people who need to be listened to in the setting, and that was exciting to me. It was a thing that I would come in the office early. I'd leave the office late. I'd work on weekends. We put in a whole bunch of time and effort to build Rogue Trader as its own line, and I think we did a really, really good job with it. It's spawned a computer role-playing game, as a matter of fact, from Alcat. But it was just a very different feel. It was, you have all the freedom you didn't have in Dark Heresy. You had all the power and wealth that you didn't have in Dark Heresy. And it really spoke to me, and it spoke to our creators, and it spoke to our fans, and it sold, like I said, really, really, really well. So after that happened, the boss was like, so can you do a third core book? And I was like, well, Deathwatch is the next natural step, so let's do that. And we made Deathwatch. There was just ever more pressure, basically, at this point, like, make more. And our team grew, and we made Deathwatch, and it was another like big hit. I remember I walked around Gen Con, I think 2010, and I felt like maybe not a king of the con, but I was like a prince, because I was like, I designed Deathwatch, and that's what everybody's lining up for. It was pretty great. And then it just kept going from there. Like Black Crusade came along, and I handed that over to Sam to give him a chance to create his own thing. And then one of our source books for Dark Heresy was going to be about guardsmen. And the more we planned out this source book, we were like, there's a whole game here. This is not just a source book. This is its own line. And we created Only War. And I was there. I was at Fantasy Flight for 3 years, 2008 to 2011. And we made like all of that stuff in that time period. And then I went off to do video games. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of work in that relatively short period, because there must have been, I mean, tens and tens of source books produced across those different ranges. I mean, what kind of process? You mentioned the Only War one there, where well, let's do a book about guardsmen, and then that grew into its own game. But what was the kind of process generally for? We want to do a supplement. We want to do a book about X. Is that how it would work? You just literally go, right, well, let's do Tyranids, and then you'd find a way to create a book about that and sort of spin it out from that point.
So, I mean, you said it yourself. It was a very aggressive production schedule, and
Right.
the bosses were like, "Hey, I've got a slot empty. What can we put here?" Sometimes that slot was just a placeholder from me. Like I'd be like, "It's a source book for Rogue Trader," or sometimes it was something a little more concrete. Like I would say, "Okay, it's an Ordo Malleus source book for Dark Heresy." I would get a little more specific. Sometimes the CEO, this is where the CEO would get involved. Sometimes the CEO would show up and be like, "I want a series of adventures, and it's called this," and he would just throw that in the schedule, and I'd be like, I don't even know what that means. Okay, well, I guess we got to make these adventures. Um, but yeah, it was more or less guided by us. We had weekly phone calls with Games Workshop, and I would keep them appraised. I would say, "Hey, we're thinking about doing a book about this. I'll send you a vision document, tomorrow to look it over. Are there any concerns right now?" And of course they would send us notes and keep us in the loop about things. And a lot of stuff, happened during that period, miniature wise. Like the Storm Raven came out for the Blood Angels, and I was like, "Ooh, can I put that in Deathwatch? Can I put that in Deathwatch?" And they had a big conversation. They're like, "Yeah, you can give the Deathwatch Storm Ravens." So it's like, yes, you know. So new minis would come out, and we'd put that stuff in there as well. But it was very much a case of us directing where we wanted to go with the source books we made, and I think interestingly enough, like the last source book for Dark Heresy, which is the Lathe Worlds,
Right.
was the Mechanicum one. That was actually the first one that I wanted to make. That's the funny thing about that, is it just kept getting pushed back by other things that we were doing. And then eventually we made it, and I really like how it turned out. So
Yeah. That's great. I mean, you mentioned that sort of the conversations with Games Workshop there. Was there ever a pressure to, like, were you allowed to get creative, I suppose, with things and say, okay, we want to invent this new thing. We want to insert something that's no longer in production, that's been a part of an earlier edition of 40K. We want to bring it back and slide it in here. Was that all quite difficult to sort of get through that? Or was there kind of quite a relaxed approach to that kind of stuff?
it was a give and take.
Right.
There were things that we would say, like one thing I really wanted to do with Rogue Traders, I wanted to bring in the Fra'al. The Fra'al are these guys that were mentioned in the Battlefleet Gothic game as being people that encounter Rogue Traders or a psychic race. And I was like, I would love to include the Fra'al in Rogue Trader. And Games Workshop was like, we'd kind of prefer you make up your own guys for your own area. And we were like, okay, so we created the Rack Gall, which
Right.
are these cool like shark alien things that you can run into as pirates. Um, and it was there was a lot of freedom in creating characters and events and things as long as they were part of our sandbox. Like if Dark Heresy takes place in the Calixis sector, Rogue Trader in the Coronis Expanse, and Deathwatch in the Jericho Reach. So if we localized it and said this is true for this place at this time,
Hmm.
it was easier. It was a lot easier. And we got to create a lot of, I think, really interesting characters, really interesting events, really fun stories and planets and things like that because they gave us that freedom. But they were, I think, quite rightly protective of the IP as a whole. So part of the reason why, for the example, the reason I was given for, we can't use for all is because they might want to do something with the for all because they were the creators of the for all.
Hmm.
And I was like, that's reasonable to me. Like, sure, you guys might want to do something with it later. That's perfectly fine. And it gave us the uh, creativity. Sometimes flourishes with restrictions. Sometimes it's better to have boundaries. So sometimes those boundaries forced us to create some different things, like the Yuvath are a really cool alien race we built for Rogue Trader as well, that I think is really neat. So the other thing that's really funny about it is a lot of this stuff, because I reached out and had writers like Owen Barnes and Andy Horror working for me, guys that should be really well known to fans of Games Workshop. Those guys wrote stuff for me that is now in the canon. Um, there's creatures from Dark Heresy that have showed up in Necromunda. There's the Ordo Chronos of the Inquisition, which started in Dark Heresy and ended up in main 40k. There's a lot of interesting little things that they pluck from the IP stuff that we built on, and I love that. I love the fact to see how it becomes more mainstream, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it's quite an interesting, as a writer and a creator, it must be an interesting sort of place to be where you are in a shared world. A world is owned by another company, and they obviously, like you say, they want to do what they want to do with it, but you're able to contribute ideas and sort of play around with the toys in the toy box a little bit. I mean, is it, because I imagine that goes across a lot of different games as well. Was it like, what is the sort of, is it a fun experience, I guess?
Oh yeah, I mean, I can go to Warhammer World right now and go upstairs to the museum and look at the display of Space Marine chapters. And right there next to the Rainbow Warriors, you can see the Storm Wardens, which is the chapter I created. So I'm pretty happy about that. That's bragging rights that not a lot of people get to have. It is wonderful. It's actually wonderful. I love lurking on various fan groups for 40k, and every so often they'll share like artwork of stuff from Dark Heresy, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I remember commissioning that. That's so cool that you guys still love that. Or they'll share. Recently, there were some people talking about the lore of the Inquisition that came out of Dark Heresy, and how that kind of they really liked some of the additions and suggestions and things that were made in there. We had some really talented guys that are also Games Workshop writers, and so it just naturally kind of flows back and forth. John French and Alan Bly did a lot of work for me. They also created a whole bunch of Horus Heresy books and novels and stuff. So there is an exchange, and I love it.
One thing that I remember really fondly from Rogue Trader was that as a party, you create the ship that the Rogue Trader, the band are all flying on. I mean, that's such a fun idea because you get everybody invested in it essentially becomes this shared character for everybody to sort of role play a little bit. I mean, was that the sort of the intention going into that? And it's a great mechanic. It's a great idea, I think.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, 150%. I had some very big ideas coming into Rogue Trader, and the first one was I didn't want to have to track my pocket change. I'm a Rogue Trader. I can buy and sell worlds. I don't need to know if I have 100 coins on my pocket. I can just be able to buy it. So we created a system for just being able to buy stuff without necessarily tracking every coin. The second thing I wanted the ship to be a member of the party and have its own sheets and have its own history and have its own quirks. And we did that as well. And the last thing is I wanted you to feel like a Rogue Trader out doing deals and making trade routes and building your empire. And that's the Endeavor system that we put in there was part of that. So yeah, those are my big ideas that I had to have, and we made them all happen. So I was very happy about that.
Yeah, it was a big success. I think it did feel like that was the party was more than just your individual characters. It was also the ship and the whole sort of lineage of the Rogue Trader house essentially was all at stake. So yeah, really, really fun. You didn't just work on the role-playing games though, did you? You also worked on some of the other FFG 40k related like board and card games as well. Is that right?
Yeah, the Horus Heresy board game, Relic, which is the 40k version of Talisman. I worked on those a little bit. I was mostly just the IP consultant.
Right.
I didn't design the games per se, but they'd be like, "Is this lore accurate?" And I would say, "Well, you need to maybe modify this a little bit to be lore accurate." And they would say, "Okay," and they'd go back and do that. So my involvement was minor, but I am happy to say that I did contribute to those. So yeah.
Great, yeah.
Chaos in the Old World, I think also.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, so you were sort of contributing in terms of okay, would the Chaos Gods really do this?
They really absolutely would. Yes, they would. God, Chaos in the Old World is so fun too. That's a good game.
Fantastic game.
I
Yeah.
like that one a lot.
So where did you then move on from FFG when you left and sort of went elsewhere in the industry?
Again, I got really lucky. A friend of mine, his name is Ed Stark. He works at ZeniMax doing Elder Scrolls Online right now, but he had been doing a whole bunch of stuff for Dungeons and Dragons, and that's how I got to know him. And he was at a company called Vigil Studios in Austin, Texas, and they were making a 40K MMO called Dark Millennium Online. And he reached out to me and said, "Hey, one of our writers is leaving. We're looking for someone to replace him. Would you like to come be a writer and work with me on this MMO?" And I had been looking for something bigger, and I was like, "Yeah, this is a great opportunity." So I took it and I left and went down to Texas. Unfortunately, Dark Millennium Online did not make it. It was canceled. It was really neat looking. Like it had the art director at Vigil was a guy called Joe Madureira, who's a comic book artist who has a very, very cool style. And that style was very much present in the game. It was seeing 40K through a slightly different artistic lens, and it was really, really neat. But it just the industry is very, very volatile, and Vigil was owned by a company called THQ, and they went under, and then the studio went under. It was a long string of reasons why that game didn't happen, but it didn't happen. The good news is I did still get to work on a game that did ship, which was Darksiders 2. And once you have a shipped game, you can basically go anywhere in the video game industry and say, "Listen, I'm a guy who got a game out. Can I work for you?" And I managed to work on quite a few video games. I've worked on Darksiders 2, which I mentioned before, a game called Regicide, which is a 40K battle chess type game. And I wrote like the entire campaign and all the characters and dialogue for that. There's Battlefleet Gothic Armada, the first one. I did all the dialogue and story for that one, which I'm very proud of. It's probably like the most, how do I put this? It may be the most bombastic purple prose I've ever written, but I just love it. If you ever watch the ending, the good ending for Armada on YouTube, you know, he talks about how the Imperial Navy is the greatest thing ever, and it's just it's so, but it's how I feel. Like it's my passion and love for the IP, but it's being expressed through this very, very upper crust British voice, and he's just saying, the Emperor's wrath. It's so bombastic, but I just love it. Those are the video games I've worked on. I'm actually working at a company called Jackalyptic right now, and I can't tell you what we're working on, but it's a lot of fun to be there. So
yeah, I mean, I'm curious actually just about how it differs. So you going back to Dark Millennium, and obviously that's if you're working on an MMO or sort of online role playing game in the same world that you've just been working on a tabletop RPG or range of. How did it differ in terms of the sort of development, the behind the scenes kind of work? Was it quite similar, or was it just a whole different world?
it was very, very different. The MMO space obviously is not telling personal stories. They're telling stories about the zone or the region, and they're telling stories about the NPCs that you get to kind of interact with and do kind of fun things on. But it is a place where the interactivity is a lot different, a lot lesser extent than say a role playing game, which is far more collaborative, right? And there was quite a few IP considerations bringing me in because I had been so steeped in it for so long that I had several objections. Actually, at the first time they told me the story, they said, "Yeah, so we've got our two factions are going to be Order and Chaos, and on the Chaos side it's Orcs and Chaos Space Marines." And I was like, "Okay, that's weird, but okay." And they're like, "And on our Order side it's going to be the Imperial Guard and the Space Marines and the Eldar." And I was like, "Okay, that might work." I said, what chapter of Space Marines are you looking at?" And they're like, "Oh, the Black Templars." I said, of all the Space Marine chapters that you could have possibly picked, the ones least likely to want to ally with Eldar is the ones you went with. And they're like, oh, really? and I said, so what Eldar craft world are you thinking about? And they're like, oh, Bealtan. And I was like, all right, we're going to have to work on this. We got to come up with some kind of story reason, because this is, wow.
So were those kind of considerations, was that like based on visuals or like, how cool something sounded or how cool something looked versus, let's build the story out of this?
That's where the decisions were made, was based on, that's a cool color scheme. We want to do that. Yeah. And I was like, oh God. But it was actually really good. I got to meet a lot of really great people, some of whom I'm still friends with 13 years later. God, I'm old. But it was good. It was fun learning how to work on video games, because I'd never done it before, and I did it in a very, I think, good learning environment to create, to learn how to structure missions and things, and getting out of the MMO space and working on the single player games like Regicide and Battlefleet Gothic Armada was so much easier because I'd learned the basics on DMO, Dark Millennium.
Right.
So,
yeah, because I imagine there's quite a difference there in terms of, because if you're building stories that can be played by many different players, and there's a lot of co-op play and whatever else might be in an MMO space, that's going to be different to a presumably more linear, potentially, is the storytelling in a single player game like Battlefleet Gothic.
Believe it or not, I actually had more branching narratives in the single player experience than I did in the MMO space, because the MMO spaces, those are the same. It's a story that's going to be the same for everybody when you go through that zone. They're going to be playing the same missions. They're going to be getting the same results. MMO spaces aren't really designed for or cater to different choices. However, Star Wars: The Old Republic came along not long after and changed all of that, because they had a very different approach to it. And that is a game I would wish I could have been able to work on, because it's really cool the way that they've incorporated the story and your choices into an MMO space.
Right.
But at the time when I was working on it, it was very, very linear for the MMO, but for the single player, I had more options, more ways to give the player a different experience on different playthroughs.
Right. Okay. I suppose that adds to replayability for a solo game as well, right?
Yeah, that's the goal for that kind of thing, is to get people to play more than once.
Yeah. Yeah. So is there? I mean, thinking then about the Battlefleet Gothic, were you able to really drill into? I mean, did you get to use the all of the different races that you weren't able to use back in the day on the RPG side?
No, there's So one of the big differences between going from a tabletop game to a video game is you have a lot more people involved, but it also means that you get less agile with some of your choices. Like in a role-playing game, I can basically describe an encounter, and I could get an artist to show you a picture of that encounter, maybe a map, right? All of which are relatively minor things that are easy to change, easy to flip around, easy to move. In a video game, I could create, for example, if I wanted to bring the For All into Battlefleet Gothic Armada, I would have to get the model designers to create the models. I'd have to get the systems designers to create how their guns work compared to everybody else's guns, and how their ships move, and how their special abilities are. And then I'd have to write barks for their captains, and I'd have to create descriptions of what their stuff does. It's just a scale change that is vastly different. So it is not something you can easily or casually do to just add something new like you can in a role-playing game. But Armada was a lot of fun. We were sticking very closely to the story that Andy Chambers told in the original books, but we still got to showcase some really great moments from that story that had never been shown in any kind of video or third person place, like the destruction of the Blackstone fortresses or the planet killer firing its big weapon. It was really, really neat to be able to get into the cinematic style, because I love being able to take something from the lore and then present it in a way that's vibrant and memorable and exciting. And you're like, oh, you get a whole new perspective or excitement or passion for that same event just through a different lens.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting point actually, just about the I suppose you're having to define more when you're making the video game version of something, aren't you? Because you are giving it all of these extra facets that you can be a bit vague about and let people imagine maybe more when
Right.
when it's on the page. Yeah, that's super interesting.
Precisely.
Yeah. So from there, I mean, you mentioned you're sort of still working on video game stuff and still writing stuff there, but you've also created a Patreon as well, right? Where you're doing tabletop content. I was curious about that. I mean, what sort of drew you to Patreon as a platform?
I mean, it is definitely a thing that a lot of my fellow creators do to bring in a little extra income, but primarily I saw it as a means of ensuring that I got something done on a weekly basis, just something for me. My Patreon is a place where, you know, every week I can say, okay, I've got something I've been thinking about. Like currently I'm thinking about like how you would do a character who wears full plate armor as a stealth character. How would you make that happen? And I was like, oh, I could write about that on my Patreon. I could create a cool set of armor or a magic item or a curse or a spell, and it keeps my mental brain engaged with creative pursuits for tabletop stuff. And it is almost entirely tabletop stuff on that Patreon. I want to be clear. If you're looking for miniatures rules, it's not there. If you're looking for video game stuff, that's not there either. Unless you want to like hear about some behind the scenes stuff, like that's where you'd go. Patreon.com/the Ross Watson is what it's called. But yeah, it's primarily a prompt to get me to keep creating things. John French says you need to set your schedule as a writer to make content happen, to keep that flow going, and that's my Patreon is my schedule to get that going.
Sure. Yeah, that's fascinating actually, because I imagine, having worked in the sort of creative industry for so long, do you have you trained your mind to be bubbling up with all of these different ideas like all the time, or do you have to sit down with a pen and paper and go, right, it's time to come up with the ideas now?
Well, it's a mix. Creative work is more of an art than a science, and specifically writing for games involves a lot of different disciplines. It's, you know, sometimes it's history, sometimes it's sociology, sometimes it's just like, does this feel right? You know, you have your own instincts and experiences playing the game itself. Sometimes it's about just letting it come to you organically, and sometimes it's about, okay, it is now time to write something. I have to put words on the page. Which is one of the more difficult things to do, is just get started, just put something down. And I always like to say, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to exist. Just get that thought out there, put it on the page, and you can come back to it later and improve it. You can always shape that sword on the anvil, you know, later. But first the sword must happen. First the sword must exist. Yeah, so it's a combination of those two approaches. I think everyone probably has their own distinct style when it comes to creating things. But for me, I sometimes will let something happen to me organically. I'll watch a movie or I'll listen to a podcast or something, and I'll be like, oh, that's a neat idea. I wonder if I could do something with that. And sometimes it's, you know, I've got to write something for my Patreon. I better have an idea. I guess I'll look back here and see if anything inspires me. Making lists of ideas is something I like to do. I'll sit down and say, oh, I've got this thought, I've got that thought, and I'll come up with a list. Honestly, there's a lot of value in having a big catalog of things you're really interested in. A lot of a lot of different genres and media and spaces that inspire you. I've drawn from things from 40K. I've said, oh, here's this really cool idea I've never thought was just developed quite enough. Maybe I'll take that, put it into a different setting and do something with it. Or I've been inspired by television shows and movies and, like I said, podcasts occasionally. And I'll say, oh, okay, hey, what if I did something like that, but change it around? Um, yeah, you find your inspiration and you work on it. It's part of the process.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, which it is interesting, isn't it? It's the sort of don't get it right, get it written kind of approach. So like you say, make it exist and then edit from there. I'm actually interested in that intersection, having been an editor as well and learned those skills. Do you sort of edit yourself as you're going, or do you like what do you write it and then come back to it as an editor, as a sort of different hat on, or do you try and do both at the same time?
So that's a more complicated question than you may think. Um, so the act of learning how to edit in my opinion, does improve your ability to write well. And I've been told by people that I have written things for as an employee that I'm an easy edit. Like I write it to where it doesn't take a lot of effort to get it into a good shape, which that makes me happy. But having been in charge of so many books over the years, I can tell you it is an ironclad rule with me specifically. You never edit your own work. And the reason why is because our brains get very used to things. We get to absorb a pattern, or we absorb a style, and then we just kind of create a mental shorthand for that. And so what happens is if you write a 2,000 word section for a game master chapter and you leave it alone and you come back to it 6 months later, you may notice it's chock full of typos because you didn't see it at the time, and your brain just skips over that. And that's true for, in my experience, is true for everyone, that they will write it in a way that makes sense to them. And a lot of times it makes sense to other people, but there's almost always something in it that a fresh set of eyes, a different set of eyes will see that can be improved. So I make it a very, very strong rule. Do you never edit your own work? You always get someone else to edit work that you've done.
Sure.
And it served me very well over the years. So yeah, when I get work edited, I have friends that I'm like, here, take this, read it, and fix it.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, you obviously, you mentioned you're sort of doing that regular work on the Patreon. You're working on some projects from a video game perspective that are sort of still under wraps. Is there anything else that's sort of on the pad for you in the future that you're looking at or you're excited about?
Yeah, I'm very excited. We are. I have a partner in a publishing company called Star Anvil Studios, and we make tabletop role playing games. We made role playing game based on the Secret Worlds MMO, and we kickstarted that last year. We kickstarted a Savage Worlds version of it this year, and we're building more material for it, which we've done very well with the Secret World, and I'm excited to see anyone who wants to play the Secret World either in 5th edition or in Savage Worlds. That's one of the things that we've got planned. But I have a ton of really great content that we're going to make through Star Anvil. We're going to build some really exciting worlds in like gritty sci-fi and superheroes and fantasy. And that is my second job, if you will. The Patreon is literally something I do just for fun, and I do get paid for that, but it's not like a job. But the Star Anvil side is absolutely a whole second career, and I really enjoy it because it allows me to play around in the medium and the industry that I came up from. Like, not a lot of people in the video game industry know who I am, but if you talk to somebody at a role-playing game store and say, "Oh, Ross Watson," they might be like, "Oh, I know that guy. He, did Star Wars: Edge of the Empire, or he did Torg Eternity." So, yeah, that's why I love doing stuff with Star Anvils. It's keeping one foot in that world while my day job is definitely, the video game space.
Yeah, I mean, and your career obviously in the tabletop space has been it's sort of broad. You've done loads of really interesting, exciting stuff. I mean, I did wonder, just as a final question, is there any RPG game out there that you haven't had a chance to work on or sort of contribute to that would be on the bucket list that you'd be like, you know what, I'd love to do a little something for that one day?
Oh my gosh. There's so many things when it comes to that for sure. Yeah, I've always wanted to do something for mainstream D&D, like a mainstream D&D book. I don't know if that's ever going to happen. They have a pretty amazing team over there, and Critical Role is keeping that going real strong. But that is something I'd always love to do. But if I had to aim a little bit lower, I've always wanted to make something for Shadowrun. Shadowrun's a really great system. Well, it's a great setting. It's been through a lot of different systems. It's a great setting that I've always wanted to do something with. So yeah, that's maybe one space I would love to jump in.
Yeah,
But,
fantastic. Yeah, I mean Shadowrun, terrific. Like D&D, a classic, and there's a lot of fun stories to tell and games to play in both of those settings, aren't there?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a ton of great stuff, but I think I'm probably always going to be most remembered for the 40K role playing game line, because it was so big for a fairly long period. For 2008 to 2011, as far as I remember, it was like the number 3 game line in the world. So it was D&D, and then Pathfinder, and then 40K roleplay. And then of course I got to design Wrath of Glory. So I've had my fingers in that pie for quite a while, and I feel like if anybody's ever going to remember me, that might be where it comes from.
Sure.
But there's a lot of worse things. There's a lot of great accomplishments and a lot of great contributions that I feel I've been able to make to people's enjoyment of that world. So
absolutely,
I just hope people think of it as fondly as I do.
I think they do. Is there anything, if you were to ever return to the 40K roleplay world, is there anything that was undone that you didn't get the chance to finish off in that space?
Oh, well, the IP has changed quite a bit since then. Back in 2008, there were Genestealer cults were not really a thing. The Skitarii were not a thing. So there's a lot of things that have kind of come out of the vaults since then that are really exciting and interesting. I suppose if I had to pick like one area that I would love to dive into a little bit more as a role-playing game, maybe something with the Mechanicum. There's always something really interesting about the Adeptus Mechanicus, as they're called in 40K. Those guys are really cool, and there's so many untold stories. So
yeah,
Night Worlds, Titans, Skitarii, you've got the Ordo Reductor, you've got just all the Myrmidons. I mean, there's tons of cool stuff for the Mechanicum that I've always wanted to get into more. So
sure, yeah. Well, we never know, I guess. But yeah, fantastic stuff. And Ross, yeah, it's been terrific to chat to you and just get your perspective on that awesome history and your amazing work. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Jordan. I really appreciate it, and I love your channel. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Ross for joining me to talk about his experiences working on White Dwarf and on the FFG 40K RPGs. It was fantastic to chat. If you would like to see more of Ross's work, you can check out his Patreon via the link down below. It's really fun and there's some great stuff on there. And if you would like to listen to these interviews as a podcast, you can now do so. Just search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery wherever you get your pods, and you should find it. I've also included in the description a link to my Patreon, which helps to support the work I do here. In fact, it's the only way I can keep doing this, so I greatly appreciate any help that you can offer there. You get access to early interviews, exclusive updates, new information about what I'm working on, a regular monthly giveaway to the end of this year, and Discord access as well. So thank you if you're able to help. And of course, if you can like and subscribe and share and comment on this video, all of that is super important as well, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you once again to Ross. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.